And we are continuing with the 8th chapter of the Chessmen of Doom. Johnny, Fergie, and the Professor are looking for the nasty, mustached British man's island, Mr. Stallybrass, but since they tried to approach at night during a rainstorm, they ended up somewhere where they didn't know where they were. Bell immediately went off when they arrived there, and they found a chapel with a light inside. They have decided that they have no choice but to enter the chapel. As they crossed the threshold, the boys and the professor looked warily around. The chapel was empty. Rows of varnished pews stretched toward the communion rail, and on the altar 6 tall candles burned. Before the rail, 3 coffins stood on sawhorses. A black woolen pall with a white cross was draped over each. A faint smell of incense and candle wax hung in the air. Silently, the professor began walking down the aisle, and the boys followed him. They paused briefly by the coffins, and then went up 3 broad steps through the gate in the railing. They stood in the sanctuary, glancing around nervously. The bell had stopped clanging, and the silence seemed deafening. Johnny felt a chill creeping over his body. He looked at the other 2, and from their pale, tense faces, he knew they felt the way he did. At last, after what seemed like forever, the professor spoke. "All this is very odd indeed," he muttered in a voice that trembled a bit. "Here we have everything ready for a funeral. A multiple funeral, it seems, and yet there are no mourners, no priests or ministers, no—" His voice died. A small door on the right side of the sanctuary had opened noiselessly, and a man in a long black cassock walked into the room. His hands were pale and bony, and his face reminded Johnny of a skull. He had red-rimmed eyes, burned in deep-set sockets. As they watched, the strange-looking man crossed the polished floor, nodded quickly toward the crucifix on the altar, and walked over to where they were standing. "Good evening," he said in an odd, high-pitched voice. "Can I be of any assistance to you?" The professor waited about half a minute before speaking. A lot of weird thoughts were running through his mind, and none of them were very pleasant. "I was wondering," he said at last, "if there is a funeral that is going to take place here." The man grinned unpleasantly. "You are very perceptive," he said in a mocking tone. "Very perceptive indeed. We are here to mourn the passing of 3 vacationers, 2 boys and an old man who died tragically in a boating accident. If you wish to stay for the funeral service, you may." The words of this strange man struck terror into the hearts of the boys and the professor. Panic rose inside them, and they began to wonder if they had gotten trapped inside a nightmare. After a wild look around, the professor dashed to the 3 coffins with a quick twist of his hand. He flicked the pall away from one and peered at the brass plate. Excuse me. That was bolted to the mahogany lid. The engraved letters seemed to squirm before his eyes. "In memory of Roderick Childermass, tragically drowned in Lake Umbagog, R.I.P." With a wild, frightened yell, the professor whirled around. The man was gone, and Johnny and Fergie stood staring at the coffins, their eyes wide with fear. "Where is he?" barked the professor. "Where the devil has he gone to?" "He just disappeared," said Johnny in a small, throaty voice. "Professor, what's going on?" Frightened, the professor grabbed Johnny's arm. "Come on, you 2, he yelled. "We've got to get out of here." The boys didn't need to be persuaded. Madly, they pounded down the aisle after the professor, and before they knew it, they were on the path, with the wind blowing rain in their faces. They tripped over logs and roots in their haste to escape. Gasping for breath, they finally arrived at the shore, where the rented boat waited. It had been raining so hard there was a lot of water in the bottom of the boat, but that did not matter. Johnny and Fergie threw their weight against the bow, and the boat slipped into the choppy, rain-swept lake. Splashing through the surf, the professor clambered into the boat and tried to start the engine. On the first 3 tries, nothing happened. He tore open the engine's hood and took out the spark plugs. After drying them hastily with his handkerchief, he put them back and once more pulled at the starting cord. The Evinrude engine roared into life, and the boat sped out onto the lake. Clinging to gunwales with their hands, the boys cheered wildly because it looked as if their troubles were over. But all of a sudden, the outboard engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Angrily, the professor jerked at the cord, but it was no use. The wind buffeted the boat. slapping it this way and that. The water in the bottom rose to ankle level, and Johnny dropped to his knees and began frantically bailing with the tomato can. "Oh God, our refuge and our strength," he prayed, saying the same phrase over and over, but his words were whipped away by the howling wind. The boat heeled to the wind, drifting helplessly, and then suddenly Fergie stood up. A wild, frightened light was in his eyes. "We're all gonna die!" he screamed, waving his arms. "Help us! Somebody please help!" "Sit down!" bellowed the professor, with his hands cupped to his mouth. "For heaven's sake, sit down or you'll—" He never got to finish his sentence. With wild windmilling gestures, Fergie lurched to one side, the boat rocked dangerously and then tipped over, and all three were plunged into the cold, churning waters of the lake. And that is the end of Chapter 8.